Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Health Z podcast. This is Logan, here along with my co-host, Luna.
Great to be back.
Okay, so gut health. I mean, it feels like you just can't avoid it, right?
Absolutely not.
You open an app, listen to a podcast, like maybe Zoe Science and Nutrition, or stream a show, maybe You Are What You Eat, and bam, you're hearing about how critical your gut microbiome is. It's like a massive topic now.
It really is. And, it taps into this genuine public curiosity, I think. People want to understand their bodies, how they work, how to feel better.
Definitely.
And the idea that these, trillions of tiny microbes inside us have such a big role, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, totally. And the story that seems to have really caught on is this second brain idea.
Right, the gut-brain axis.
Exactly, the gut affecting mood, immunity, like everything. And, well, naturally, when there's this big idea, solutions pop up.
Always.
We're seeing probiotics absolutely everywhere. Fermented foods are suddenly trendy again.
Kimchi, kombucha.
Yeah. And all these fixes for something called leaky gut. Plus, you can even, mail away a sample for your own personal microbiome map.
The direct-to-consumer tests, yeah.
It's wild. I saw a stat that searches for gut health shot up, over 35% just this year. People are definitely interested.
That kind of engagement is huge. But, and this is where it gets interesting for our deep dive today, there's also this growing wave of skepticism, maybe, or at least caution, coming from parts of the scientific community about some of these really popular narratives and the products being sold.
Okay, so that's exactly what we're getting into. We want to sort of unpack these big gut health trends everyone's talking about and compare them to what the experts, the actual researchers, are saying in recent studies. We've got some medical journal articles, plus a really interesting summary from a committee discussion.
Right, that brought together gastroenterologists, microbiome researchers, nutritionists, dietitians, a real mix of perspectives.
Cool. So let's maybe start with why some experts are hitting the brakes a bit on all the hype. Where does the skepticism begin?
Well, a really good starting point is probiotics. There was an article, I think it was last October, in Nature Review's Gastroenterology and Hepatology.
Yeah.
The title was pretty direct: Probiotics, Sorting Fact from Fiction in the Gut Health Hype. It basically tackles head-on these claims that probiotics are, miracle workers.
Fact from fiction.
Thanks.
Okay, so they're saying the benefits are maybe overblown.
Yeah.
Because they're pushed as cure-all sometimes.
That's exactly the argument the authors make. They say a lot of the marketing, the broad claims, just don't have solid, specific evidence behind them.
Oh, so?
Well, for one, they stress that what might help one specific condition or even one person doesn't necessarily help another. The results in clinical trials often pretty inconsistent.
Ah, okay. Not a universal fix then.
Not at all. And here's a key thing they point out.
Yeah.
Many of those probiotics you buy off the shelf, they don't actually engraft. They don't successfully set up shop in your gut long term.
So they just pass through.
Pretty much, for many of them. So the whole idea that taking any probiotic supplement will automatically boost your gut health, the science isn't really there to back that up universally. The article really pushes for more, targeted, personalized approaches, not just this blanket promotion we see everywhere.
Right. So when I see an ad for, a yogurt that promises amazing gut health, it's probably more complicated than that.
It's almost certainly more complicated. There might be some benefit in specific situations, sure, but the general hype often ignores the nuances.
Okay.
And, thinking about how people get this info, there was another study, this one in JMI Formative Research back in May 2022. It looked at YouTube videos about the gut microbiome. Its title was basically Misinformation about the Human Gut Microbiome in YouTube Videos.
Uh-oh. YouTube?
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of people get health advice there. What did they find?
Well, it was kind of striking. They found that only about, less than 20% of the videos they looked at were actually made by medical professionals.
Wow, that low.
Yeah. And worse, a lot of them had misleading or just plain inaccurate information, especially about probiotics, that leaky gut idea we mentioned, and those home testing kits.
So there's a real disconnect between the actual science and what people are watching online.
Exactly. And that gap can definitely fuel these overhyped trends, make people think these things are more proven than they are.
That is a bit concerning, yeah. People trying to do the right thing, but getting maybe not so great advice.
Precisely. And that brings us nicely to another area where there's quite a bit of skepticism, this whole leaky gut syndrome concept, and also whether those home microbiome tests are actually useful.
Okay, yeah.
There was a review article November 2021 in Current Opinion in Clinical Nutrition and Metabolic Care, The Gut Microbiome, Hype, Hope, and Future Challenges. It dug into these.
Leaky gut. You hear that phrase constantly. It sounds pretty bad, like things are leaking out that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
What's the scientific view?
Well, it's interesting. Scientists agree that increased intestinal permeability, basically, the gut lining becoming less tightly sealed, is a real thing. You see it in specific conditions like, say, inflammatory bowel disease.
Okay, so it exists in some contexts.
Right. But this review questioned whether leaky gut syndrome is a valid, distinct diagnosis on its own that explains all sorts of general health problems in people who don't have those specific diseases. The authors basically said there isn't strong evidence linking it to a wide range of systemic issues outside of known gut disorders.
So it's not necessarily this catch-all explanation for feeling unwell that it's sometimes made out to be.
The current scientific consensus leans towards no, not as a distinct syndrome causing widespread issues. And the same review also had some pretty strong words about the at-home microbiome tests.
Ah, the mail-in kits. What were the concerns there?
A big one is the lack of standardization. Different companies test differently, analyze differently.
Inconsistent results.
Potentially, yeah. But even more importantly, there's a real lack of understanding about how to translate those results into truly meaningful, actionable advice for individuals. The review cautioned against using these tests to guide things like taking lots of probiotics, partly because, as we said, the efficacy is variable, and there can even be risks for certain people.
So again, the message is more about caution.
Very much so. From this viewpoint, the focus really ought to be on established dietary advice, like eating whole foods, fiber, rather than relying on these tests or supplements as a primary strategy.
It really feels like the scientific community, or at least a significant part of it, is saying, whoa, slow down, let's stick to the basics, rather than jumping on every new trend.
That's a good summary of the skeptical perspective, yeah.
Now, you mentioned that committee discussion where different experts weighed in. That sounds fascinating. Like we get to hear the arguments directly.
Exactly. It really highlighted the differing viewpoints on these key issues. Probiotics, leaky gut, and the testing kits. Let's maybe start with a probiotic debate within that group.
Okay, so who was making the case for probiotics having broader benefits?
Well, on that side, you had proponents like a gastroenterologist, a microbiome researcher, and a nutritionist. They pointed to some studies, like one in the journal Gut, suggesting certain probiotic strains can help with things like IBS symptoms or improving the gut barrier in specific situations.
Okay, so some positive evidence cited.
Yes, and they also brought up patient reports, people saying they felt better, had better digestion, more energy after taking them. The American Gut Project also came up, linking microbiome diversity, which you might get from fermented foods, to better health.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also this empowerment angle, the idea that talking about probiotics makes people feel they can take active steps for their health.
Right, that makes sense. So what did the skeptics on the committee push back with?
The skeptics, another gastroenterologist, a microbial ecologist, a dietitian, they really doubled down on the points from that Nature Reviews article we talked about.
Yeah.
They stressed that any benefits seem very, very strain-specific. It's not about probiotics in general. They highlighted that many products just lack good evidence, and maybe the placebo effect plays a role in some reported improvements.
Placebo effect.
Yeah. They also cited big reviews, meta-analyses, like one in The Lancet, showing pretty inconsistent results when you look at probiotics in generally healthy people, and they raised a really important safety point, potential harm for people who are immunocompromised, referencing a paper in Clinical Infectious Diseases.
It's a serious concern.
Definitely. Their overall argument was that focusing too much on probiotics might distract from the proven benefits of diet and lifestyle.
So a clear divide there.
Mm-hmm.
Potential specific benefits versus lack of general proof and some safety worries. What about leaky gut? Was the committee split on that too?
Very similar dynamic. The proponents, again, maybe the researcher, one of the gastroenterologists, the nutritionist, they agreed that increased permeability is real in certain diseases, citing research, for instance, from the Journal of Gastroenterology. They suggested maybe leaky gut is just a term people use to describe symptoms linked to an imbalanced gut microbiome or dysbiosis. They mentioned patients feeling better on elimination diets and pointed to some functional medicine studies linking gut barrier issues to things like autoimmune conditions. And again, the empowerment argument came up.
And the skeptics' response. Still unconvinced about it being a widespread syndrome.
Pretty much. They kept coming back to that current opinion review, saying there's just no strong evidence for it as a standalone diagnosis causing broad problems.
Right.
They argued that, sure, permeability increases in IBD or celiac disease, but you can't just generalize that to explain fatigue or brain fog in someone without those conditions. They felt many-sided studies weren't broadly applicable. And they mentioned a warning from the Gastrointestinal Society about these kinds of unvalidated diagnoses being used to sell supplements.
Okay, so the skeptics see it more as, let's diagnose and treat the known conditions, not chase this fuzzier concept.
That seems to be the gist, yeah. Focus on established diseases first.
And finally, the at-home microbiome tests. What was the debate there?
Well, the proponents were quite positive about the technology itself, like the 16S RNA sequencing that companies like Zoe use. They saw it as a potential future tool for personalized nutrition, pointing to research exploring this, like a study in Nature.
Personalizing diets based on your microbes.
That's the hope, yeah.
Yeah.
They argued these tests can, empower consumers, get them interested in their gut health, and some people apparently do feel more motivated to eat better after getting results.
Okay, the potential upside. What were the counterarguments from the skeptics?
Several big ones. They circled back to that JMIR study on misinformation and the lack of standardization and testing we talked about. How do you compare results? How do you get reliable advice?
Right, the consistency issue.
Exactly. They stress that current tests just can't reliably predict your future health risks or tell you exactly what to eat because the microbiome is so complex and changes all the time. They brought up clinical guidelines, like from the American Gastroenterological Association, which explicitly don't recommend routine microbiome testing for patients right now.
So the main medical bodies aren't endorsing them yet?
Not for routine clinical use, no. And the dietitian on the panel made a great point, and often the advice these tests generate is super general, like eat more fiber, cut back on processed food.
Stuff we kind of already know is good for us.
Exactly. Advice a registered dietitian could give you based on established nutritional science without needing an expensive test that might not even be that accurate or useful clinically. They also mentioned an NBC News report from last year questioning the real-world clinical value.
So it sounds like the technology might be interesting, maybe even promising for the future. But for now, the practical, actionable value is still pretty questionable from the skeptical view.
That sums it up well. Hype versus current clinical reality.
Okay, so after hashing out all these different, sometimes conflicting viewpoints, did this committee manage to agree on anything? Did they come up with some overall conclusions or recommendations for us, the public?
They did, actually. They managed to find some common ground and put out some collective statements, which is helpful.
Great. What did they agree on?
First, everyone agreed that the gut microbiome is incredibly important for health. The research showing that is solid and growing, no debate there.
Okay, baseline agreement. Good.
But, and this was a major point, they strongly emphasized the big gap between that scientific understanding and a lot of the popular claims floating around, especially about probiotics, leaky gut, and the home tests.
The hype versus the evidence.
Precisely. They really highlighted how the commercial side of things, the products and services, has often raced ahead of the science, leading to public confusion and potentially misinformation.
That's a crucial takeaway. So given that gap, what did they advise people to actually do for their gut health?
Their advice was really grounded in, common sense and established healthy practices. The number one recommendation, focus on your diet. Eat a diverse range of whole foods, lots of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes. That's the foundation.
The basics work best.
Seems so. They did mention fermented foods, saying they might offer benefits for some people, but suggested getting personalized advice from a dietitian is better than just grabbing trendy commercial products.
Okay, makes sense. What about probiotics?
Approach with caution. They acknowledged that specific probiotics may help specific conditions, but only under medical supervision. They are definitely not a one-size-fits-all fix. They advised against just picking up over-the-counter supplements without knowing if the specific strain has evidence for your issue.
Talk to your doctor first.
Absolutely. And especially if you have any immune system issues, definitely consult a provider before taking probiotics.
Got it. And the advice on leaky gut and the tests.
Be skeptical. That was the clear message. Be wary of unproven claims like leaky gut syndrome being the cause of everything. And don't put too much faith in the current generation of at-home microbiome tests to give you definitive answers.
So where should people go for reliable info?
Seek diagnoses and treatments from qualified, licensed healthcare professionals. Critically evaluate what you see in the media or online. And try to stay informed through trustworthy sources, peer-reviewed journals if you can access them, or information from major gastroenterology societies. Basically, avoid the quick fixes and prioritize lifestyle changes that have real evidence behind them.
So stepping back, the big picture seems to be, yes, the gut microbiome is super interesting and important, but we need to be really careful about the hype. Focus on the fundamentals, good diet, consulting professionals, rather than getting swept up in trends that might not have solid science behind them yet.
That's it exactly. It's about having a balanced, critical perspective. The science is exciting and moving fast, but many popular claims have simply outpaced the proof right now.
Really helpful insights for navigating all this gut health noise. Thanks for breaking that down.
My pleasure.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to chew on. As this microbiome science keeps evolving so rapidly, what are the ethical questions around marketing these tests and products directly to us? How do we balance giving people tools to feel empowered about their health with the very real risk of spreading misinformation when the science is still developing? Something to think about.